Hello everyone, this is Serious Trivia. Welcome back to our last part for our Mandate of Heaven Yellow Turban Reform Guide that will cover the tips and tricks of the Reform Tree. So previously we have covered the overview of all four branches, did them in detail in part 2 and part 3, and this part we're just going to be looking at some of the mechanics with the research rate as well as some of the early path reforms that you should consider for your games. So to kick things off, just a reminder, these four trees individually represent infrastructure and economy in the first one with the red tree, the blue tree representing philosophy and trade, yellow tree representing military power, and the pink tree representing military doctrine. And in total, there are only 75 reforms, with 23 in the red tree, 19 in the blue tree, 18 in the yellow tree, and finally 15 in the pink tree. And we broke them down into four different groups of reforms. There are 4-turn reforms, 6-turn reforms, 10-turn reforms, and 15-turn reforms. But unlike the base game, what we have with the turns here is something that will change depending on your research rate. So research rate is something that is unique to Yellow Turbans, and you start out at 100% research rate. So what you would do here is take your turn number and you would divide it by the percentage for the number of turns it will take you to research that particular reform. So here, 4-turn reforms take 4 turns, and so forth. So the way we categorize them is entirely based on the original 100% research rate. But you can actually increase your research rate in the game, and let's say you increased it to 200%. So at 200%, you'll be dividing by 2. So 4-turn reforms become 2-turn reforms, 6-turn reforms become 3-turn reforms, 10-turn reforms become 5-turn reforms, and 15-turn reforms become 8-turn reforms. This 8-turn reform here is actually quite important because when you divide 15 by 2, you get 7.5. And you're not actually rounding the number to 8. How reforms work is that after 7 turns of research is completed, you still have 0.5 turns of research left to finish this reform. So you must spend 1 entire turn to complete it. You can't research half a turn worth of research. So in some senses, if you have a percentage that's dividing into the big number, let's say you're dividing 10 by 300%, then you're getting 3.33. That would still take 4 turns instead of 3 turns. It's not rounding. Even if it's 2.0001, that would still be 3 turns. So this fact is quite crucial when you're considering how efficiently to research your reforms and the order you should approach them. Aside from this, the first thing we must solve is how do we actually increase our research rate? And to answer that question, there are 2 main ways to do it. The first way is through a building chain that's available for all Yellow Turbans, and this building chain is quite simple. It just increases your research rate while providing you a little bit of bonus enlightenment to help your faction rank up. The other way, and the more common way, is to use Insight skill. So Insight is a skill that you'll find on many of your general skill tree. It is technically a scholar skill as dictated by the sky symbol or Tian on the picture of the icon. Thus, all scholars will actually have this skill, and this skill will automatically provide your faction with a 10% boost to research rate, making this probably one of the easiest and best ways to increase your research rate. So taking a deep look at both methods, first we have the building chain here. It goes from level 1 to level 5 in a linear progression that goes from 5% research all the way to 25% research rate with 5% increments. And the cool thing about this building chain here is that you need reforms to actually unlock the last 2 levels. So you need reforms to help you speed up getting more reforms. So that also means the first 3 buildings require no reforms and can be built on all small city level settlements. So you can technically spam these buildings in your non-income focused commanderies to help bolster your research rate faction wide. Now technically, the level 4 tier building can also be built inside a small city. Only the level 5 building is restricted by a small regional city or your settlement level. That also means when you're looking at the reforms that's needed to unlock both of these, Center of Healing for the level 4 upgrade, and Institutionalized Taoism for the level 5 upgrade. And if you look at where they're placed on the tree, they are in the infrastructure and economy tree, and they're quite deep in the tree. Center of Healing is a 10-turn reform, so it's not actually that hard to get it. It's 4 reforms deep, and takes about 24 turns with 100% research rate, and you can definitely speed this up as you go for it, since you're unlikely to go for it in the early game. There's really no reason to go for Institutionalized Taoism in my opinion, since the construction of the level 5 building requires a small regional city. I typically do not upgrade my settlements to small regional city unless they're income focused settlement. Therefore, I would not be wasting a precious building slot on a research building. So I tend to stay away from this reform. Now the +2 assignment from this reform is kind of worth it because additional assignments gives you the chance to recruit additional characters, since Yellow Turbans in the Mandate of Heaven have a special assignment that allows you to recruit new characters, and with each scholar that you recruit, you will always get insight, thus you'll always get 10 additional percentage. So that aspect of the bonus is quite nice. But given that it's a 15-turn reform at the end of the tree, I highly recommend you to just avoid it. If you have the free time, consider getting Center of Healing. The 10% income boost to commerce and industry is also quite nice. And moving on, the other method of increasing research rate is Insight. We've already been talking about it quite a bit. You get 10% research rate, +2 enlightenment, 8% range block chance, and some stat boost for this skill. Now, this skill is not available on all characters. It is only available on a select few, depending on the background. Now, since this is a scholar skill, all scholar classes or backgrounds will include this skill. But if you get a brewer or a builder, they start out with this skill on level 1, since this skill is placed on the center of their skill tree. So it's quite nice to go after these two backgrounds in particular when you're trying to boost your research rate. For healers, mediators, fortune tellers, singers, and physicians are all generic backgrounds that will grant this skill on their skill tree. And for veterans, monks, sorcerers, and philosophers are the only backgrounds that will have insight. So definitely keep your eye out for these characters and try to level them up so you can grab the insight skill to boost your research rate and thus make your faction stronger by gaining more enlightenment as well as new bonuses, new units from your reform tree. And speaking of our reform tree and looking at the turns, here's the breakdown of all the major breakpoints in research rate corresponding to the number of turns you will spend on the various reforms. And to highlight some of the key bonuses that I think you should pay attention to, here is the first one you should think about when upgrading your research rate, and that is the 120% research rate mark. Here is where your 6-turn reforms drop a turn to 5 turns. This might not seem like much, but it's very easy to get 120% research rate at the start of the game. You just need 2 characters with the insight skill. As a matter of fact, 2 of the 3 Jung brothers actually start the game out at 110%, because they already have a character at the beginning with the insight skill. If you can easily recruit another one, you'll be at 120%, and you'll be able to save that turn to efficiently research a 6-turn reform. And 6-turn reforms are important because they are very early game, and there are a lot of very key 6-turn reforms for you to go after. So getting that 1-turn savings is quite crucial. Aside from this, the next key breakpoint is 135%. Now also, not a very significant number, but at this point, your 4-turn reforms finally lose their first turn, so they drop down to 3 turns, and that 1-turn saving is quite significant for 4-turn reforms, which are often your first reform or first few reform in any of the given 4 trees, making them somewhat of importance in the early game. So maybe if you're already focused on a tree, keep going deeper into it until you get to 135% research rate. That way you get that full term saving before switching to an entirely new tree, because as you can see, even 125% before this, your 10-turn reform and your 15-turn reform are already enjoying a 2-turn and 3-turn discount. So you can definitely wait just for one more character to join your court for you to get that extra insight for the 135%. Now lastly, another key one we have talked about is all the way down at 250%. Now you might think 250% is very hard to reach, but actually it's quite easy to get 15 characters that have insight or a mix of characters and buildings. But the reason why I'm highlighting this key percentage here is beyond this point, I feel like you're just receiving a very minimum return for increasing your research rate. Here is where you have pretty much all your savings in place. Your 4-turn reforms are 2 turns, since 200%. Your 6-turn reforms are 3 turns, since 200%. And they won't decrease down to 2 turns until 300%. And if you want them all the way down to 1 turn, it has to be 600%. So you see the amount of increase in research rate you need for a 1-turn saving start getting larger and larger as you go down. So around 250%, you're at a very nice sweet spot where it's now 2 turns, 3 turns, 4 turns, and 6 turns. And if you move on a little bit farther, you need to go up by 50% to make it 2 turns, 2 turns, 4 turns, and 5 turns. So you're technically getting 2 turns of saving by moving up 50%, but you can technically play around with which reform you're going after. Perhaps you're focusing heavily on 10-turn reforms at the time you're at 250%, and as you naturally go up, you can start tackling your remaining 6-turn reforms and 15-turn reforms after you hit 300. But overall, I think 250 is a pretty nice spot to aim for your mid to late game. And anything beyond is just extra. So now that we know how to increase research rate and how to efficiently use our research rate to pick out which reform to go after, how should we approach things from the start when we have either 100% or just 110% and there's no discount to your 4-turn and 6-turn reforms? Well, here is my recommended start for any of the 3 John brothers, because in the early game, your key focus is to win the Mandate War, which, as I repeated many times in this guide series, is pretty much the reason for Yellow Turbans in the 182 campaign. Within the first 8 turns or so, you'll be thrusted into a war with the rest of the Han Empire, and floods of strong enemy units will be approaching your settlements. So you must be able to defend yourself as well as fight back. So to do so, you must focus on the military doctrine and military power trees. Thus is why I picked the first 3 reforms in these 2 trees. And from these first 3 reforms, the first one is mandatory drill from the military doctrine tree. This is a nice savings reform. It gives you a nice amount of enlightenment for 4 turns at 15, which will help you rank up. And the 15% retinue upkeep might seem insignificant at first when you just have 1 army that's not very expensive, but in the early game you don't have much money at all, so any 15% saving is going to help you a lot. It's basically buy 7 units, get 1 free, so you'll be able to have 8 units whereas you would have 7. So that's technically how you should think about it. And as you move on into the late game, as you have multiple armies on the field, this saving is just going to keep on going. So this is why I like to have this reform first, because the earlier you get it, the more saving you'll be enjoying throughout your whole campaign. Next up, the key focus is on the military power tree. And here on this tree, we're mainly gunning for General of the Flying Stone. This is a 6-turn reform that amazingly gives 30 points of enlightenment, gives you cow troops for your units, which is actually very powerful. And of course, the key reason why we're actually going for this is for trebuchets, which really changes the battle dynamic of the game. So definitely consider getting General of the Flying Stones as your 3rd reform. Now you could also go for this as your 2nd reform and just go for it since the beginning of the game, because this is very valuable, but I tend to want to maximize my savings or earnings, so I tend to go for mandatory drill. And another key reason why you should focus on General of the Flying Stone is because if you look at the way the branch is structured, this reform actually leads to all the remaining military powers reform, thus all the unit unlocks you require for your entire faction. So without this, no better units in your army composition. So this is also another key reason why you should go for General of the Flying Stone early on, unless you intend to play with a peasant focused style, which obviously works, as I have proven with the Zhangjiao campaign. But if you want to try out some of the more unique offerings from the Yellow Turban factions, definitely consider getting your General of the Flying Stones early. So moving on, another key issue we will run into in our Yellow Turban games if you play beyond the Mandate War is that as you expand, corruption's going to creep up. And without the standard state workshop buildings, you can't actually fight back corruption. So what you need to do is try to get as much faction-wide corruption reduction as you can, and that includes getting reforms like enlightenment in the philosophy and trade tree. It's quite early reform. It just requires 2 prerequisite reforms, and it itself is a 10-turn reform that grants you 20 points enlightenment, 50 reserve capacity in all your commanderies, and minus 10% corruption. The minus 10% corruption is the only thing we're interested here, as this will help lower your overall percentage as you expand out. Another way Yellow Turbans can actually fight back in corruption is to use the copper mine buildings. There are 6 copper mine buildings on the map, and if you can upgrade them to level 5, you'll be able to enjoy 4% corruption reduction in each of those counties. So if you have 6, that's minus 24% faction-wide. If you have 5, it's minus 20% faction-wide. So just try to get as many as you can. 3 of them are in the south, so try to go to the south. And the reforms that's required to get these upgrades from level 4 and level 5 is March of the Heavenly Way and the expedited deployment. Of these, March of the Heavenly Way is actually quite a good reform to get because you do get 2 extra army slots, and there are a lot of localization skills like minus 20% corruption just by having a general stand in the commandery itself. So you could get extra army slot, pump out 3 generals, that's minus 60% corruption in that local commandery, put it where you make the most money, and all the corruption would be gone. So you need army slots to do that, and March of the Heavenly Way not only sets you up with a level 4 copper mine, also increase your army count by 2. Aside from these reform changes, reform also gives you enlightenment, and enlightenment gives you faction rank. So as you rank up, if you move on to Ascended and Enlightened, these are the last 2 tiers of your faction rank, you'll be enjoying a 10% corruption reduction and a 15% corruption reduction. Now these are not additive. At Ascended, your total corruption reduction you will receive from your faction rank is 10%, and at Enlightened, it increased by 5% to a total of 15%. So it's not minus 25% when you get to these ranks, it's minus 10% at Ascended and minus 15% at Enlightened, which is still a nice amount to have consider the low amount of corruption reduction you have available to you. So typically you'll be able to get 25% from the reform plus this rank up bonus, and then the rest depends on your copper mine control as well as your general position in terms of leadership roles with the honest trait or with items like discourse of the state that can all help combat your corruption, as well as the use of local leaders, which are Yellow Turban administrators, which will also help reduce local corruption by additional 30%. So overall, you just want a few key income producers where you have heavy anti-corruption measures, and the rest of your faction, just try to utilize them as best as you can without the local leader positions and at high corruption rates. Moving on, we talked about a little bit about leaders, and Yellow Turbans actually suffers from having a very simple court structure. It has the leader, and then you have 3 generals: general of the people, general of the land, and general of the heaven. However, these 3 roles are not linked to your faction rank like most regular Han factions. These 3 positions require healer, scholar, and veteran, and these 3 are all locked by reforms, and you need to reach the end of the philosophy and trade tree on 3 separate branches of 15-turn reforms to unlock these, and they are the Great Taoist Peace to unlock your healer position, your dedication to the land to unlock your veteran position, and finally Adobe of the Heavenly Masters to unlock your scholar position. These are nice, because these 3 roles will contribute to your faction-wide bonus with their traits and skills and items, but it's a heavy investment in terms of reform. So I would wait for these for later, because the only reason you would need these roles and these bonuses is if you're going for a long campaign that moves beyond the mandate wars. So first focus on fighting the mandate war by going after military power and military doctrine, and then if you're proceeding on to the rest of the game where you're trying to reach emperor status and you're trying to paint the map, that's when you have too much land, where you have high base income that can take advantage of the income bonuses from these leadership roles, as well as the corruption measures that you get from having additional leadership bonuses. So civic reforms later and military reform first is a good mantra to think about when tackling the Mandate of Heaven Yellow Turban reforms. And with that said, there isn't much more tips and tricks for me to leave you. That reform turn is probably the best thing you can refer to when thinking about when to research a certain reform when you feel lost. When you feel like none of the bonuses is something that you desperately want and you're just trying to be efficient and trying to min-max your way to a better choice in terms of gameplay. So with that ends our guide in this series. Hope you guys enjoyed this and see you guys next time. Bye!